All right. Well, it's 1:03. I think we've got maybe a handful of folks still joining us, but I think we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this Riparian and Wetland Setback Implementation Workshop. The purpose of this workshop is to help communities that have riparian or wetland setbacks better implement those codes to achieve the intended benefits of setbacks. Things like reducing flood impacts, reducing pollutants in waterways, and minimizing streambank erosion, and the need for costly engineering solutions to protect structures, and also for preserving quality of life and property values. So this was intended as a statewide audience. For anybody who's here, we're so glad you're here. But our target was community planning and zoning and Board of Zoning Appeals board members, zoning inspectors, engineers, planners, elected officials, developers, home builders associations, really anyone involved in implementing local zoning codes in Ohio. So welcome all. This workshop will be recorded, and the recording will be provided to everyone who registered for the workshop today. So if you have to hop off early or anything like that, no problem. We'll be sending that recording to everybody. Right. So this is the agenda for our workshop today. Our first hour here is really going to be diving into what are the benefits of protecting our riparian zones. A lot of communities that are represented here today already have riparian or wetland setbacks, so this is just a refresher. What are setbacks? Why do communities generally use them? What is the benefit to your community? And then we'll take a 5-minute break. Our second hour is really going to dive into how to consider setbacks during development plan review and approval, really considering those setbacks early on in the development review process. We'll also talk a bit about how to handle variance requests, and then we will have some time for questions and answers. Then we'll take a 5-minute break, and our last hour together will really be a focus on learning from each other. And we've got a lot of communities represented here today. We're going to have a community highlight from Concord Township in Lake County to talk about that township's experience with implementing their riparian setbacks. And then we're also going to take 15 minutes to do some breakout discussions to really give us all time to learn from one another, lessons learned, challenges, things that have worked, not worked, and so forth. And so we'll have a little bit of time for that before we wrap up for the day. If you have any technical issues throughout the workshop, please contact Kevin Saraceno. His phone number and his email are there on the screen, and I will work on popping those in the chat as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Kate Chappell with Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. She's going to cover the community benefits of healthy riparian zones.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm excited for this. As Kim just said, I'm Kate Chappell. I am the Euclid Creek Watershed Coordinator at Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. This is just a photo of beautiful said Euclid Creek. But my job, I think, this morning as first speaker is to just give us a bit of a base on where we are, what do we mean by riparian zone, what are some of the community-wide ecological benefits, and we'll move on from there. But I've also had the good luck of working with Kim and some other partners on updating and providing some tools to educate your residents about these sorts of policies. And so if you ever need something like that, Kim and I can offer some things. So next slide. So I wanted just to start basically with riparian zones and riparian as a definition. So generally speaking, we just mean whatever's next to a creek or any other sort of body of water. And I've got a map here that was created by Biohabitats to illustrate that. So you can see there's a stream in the more or less middle, and the riparian zone is outlined, and there's a wetland in that zone as well. And you can see that it's not even on either side. You know, the south side is a lot more narrow than the northern side, and it doesn't perfectly follow the meanders of this creek. And there's a lot of things influencing where this zone is going to be, including, topography, watershed size, the stream width, things like that. And so what I have to assume in terms of why this is more narrow on the south side is perhaps a drop in the topography. And I do want to distinguish early on here too that riparian zone and riparian setback are not one and the same. And so Kim will be getting into more of the definition and the use of the setbacks, of course, but riparian zone is more of an ecological term, and riparian setback would be more of a policy term. So next slide. All right, so other things that could be in this zone or other words we're going to be hearing. I often, when I'm working with the public, will hear folks use the terms floodplain, watershed, wetland, et cetera, sort of interchangeably. And while a lot of those things are included in the riparian zone, they're not necessarily one and the same. So if the riparian zone has wetlands nearby that are contiguous with the zone, that usually gets added to that outline, along with 100-year flood risk sorts of things and other things as well. Next slide. All right, so I tried to find a cool video of this river moving, and there's plenty of examples of rivers moving that are not local, but I wanted to find something at least a little bit more local. So this is a map of the Mississippi River and how it's changed over time. So it almost looks like abstract art, but all these squiggles and bends are old courses of this river. So you can see it's changed over time. This is not a static place. And so the stream, the river is going to move. It's going to move either into infrastructure or not, and the riparian zone is going to move with it. So in that way, I've seen, at least in the codes around Cuyahoga County that I'm familiar with, there's often a reference to the Soil and Water District as a resource to help folks determine where this zone is or where the setback is. And a lot of that I encourage you to do, even if you have a riparian setback map or a riparian zone map, because those things may have changed over time. And it's always a good idea to ground truth some of those things as you're in the process of development or working around the stream. All right, next slide. So what services do these provide? So this graph is from the USDA and US EPA. And I think a lot of what we'll talk about today is ecosystem services around erosion control and flood relief, slowing that intensity. Obviously, there are other benefits to protecting these zones, but I'll draw your attention to the second bullet point where it says healthy vegetated riparian zones. And that's really where we're getting the ecosystem level benefits, is when these things are vegetated, ideally with native vegetation in a healthy state. So we often recommend 25, 50, 75 feet as a setback, and that is connected to where these benefits fall. So you can see that right near the left of the graph, maybe around 10, 25 feet of a buffer, that's when you're going to see the stream bank stabilization, which would be erosion control and some water temperature moderation. Just with vegetation overhanging the creek or the river, cooling that water down becomes important for cold water habitats, fish, etc. And then sort of around the 30 or so mark, you're going to see more nutrient removal, sediment removal benefits. And this is something really important in my work as a watershed coordinator, because any stream or wetland restoration project that we have going on, the funders are going to want to see how much are we reducing nutrients and sediments into the stream and downstream of us. And so you can see that that's going to be right in that like 30-ish kind of foot range. But by the time you get to around 100 feet or 120 feet or so, you're not going to continue to get more and more benefit, at least for that particular thing, the farther you go. But you can see that the flood control, what the other version of this that we're going to be talking about in addition to erosion, that really doesn't quite come into play until like 75 feet or so. And so to get a lot of flood control benefit, the buffers may need to be a little bit wider. Wildlife habitat is a great benefit across all of these widths of a buffer. But you can see that at some point, having more of a buffer isn't necessarily going to benefit us for erosion control and flood control. And this depends on this is on both sides of the stream. So this is 25, et cetera, feet on both banks of the stream. And depending on how large the watershed is and how much water is coming to the particular point you're at, that will also influence the recommendation on how wide that buffer should be. All right, next slide. I've got some pictures of the ugly here. So unprotected riparian zones, just wanted to illustrate some of the things that can happen when we don't have protections on these zones and along our streams. And the left photo really does show a lot of the sediment issue that can happen in streams. So you can see that the banks have eroded down. A lot of sediment and nutrients will be transported through that stream. It's not going to be good habitat. It's not going to be good fishing, all of that. And then the center photo is meant to demonstrate really the threat to infrastructure that we may see. So obviously these buildings, these homes are very close to the erosion of this creek bed here. And, as those streams and rivers move, like we know that they will move, this is going to threaten infrastructure. And then the photo on the right there is more to illustrate the types of vegetation that we might suggest for a healthy riparian zone. This is just turf grass, and you can see how this hillside is slumped a bit. And turf grass really just has short root systems compared to many of our native species. So always recommending that we have good native vegetation around our streams. All right, next slide. So, and then the pretty pictures. So some of the good things that happen when we protect our riparian zones. These are all pictures from Euclid Creek. And you can see that the bottom left photo here is a picture from the Acacia Reservation. I think this must have been a stream cleanup of sorts a few years back. Volunteers with Cleveland Metro Parks. I know that there's also been volunteer events for tree planting in this area as well. But this was a really hefty stream restoration project, and the banks are protected within the Acacia Reservation now. And we're able to have these community events, volunteer events. I've done a few presentations and hikes and such just around this particular section of Euclid Creek because it is so beautiful there. And then the top right photo, we've got a group of school kids looking for macroinvertebrates. So we also bring school kids out to look for these bugs, learn about them, learn about the creeks. And this is really only possible when the habitat is healthy enough and the water quality is healthy enough for these things to be living. So you can see that, these are not steep banks. We can get the students in very easily. These are nice, soft banks that we can get into and have kids out for the school day. And then the other two photos are just to be pretty, right? So and this is what I mean by vegetation that is more than just turf grass, right? So we've got forest around some of this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be forest to be healthy, but more than turf grass is usually ideal. So these create, senses of community, and we can do these kinds of events in these zones because they are healthy and protected, where if I were to try to plan a stream cleanup and there's an eroded bank or I can't get down into the creek easily with volunteers, it's just not somewhere where I'm going to be able to host events for the community. Okay, next slide. So I'll wrap up sort of my baseline for the day because I don't want to steal thunder from other folks, but setbacks as a zoning tool, right? So when we have these healthy riparian zones, we're experiencing these benefits. And it is going to be more cost effective to prevent some of the issues that we saw in the unprotected zone slide than it is to react to the problems. If we have to be hard armoring streams, putting gabion baskets in, if you're having to constantly repair or rebuild structures, that is obviously time consuming and costly and can be a threat to just the health and safety of the community. And the protected infrastructure in your community is also going to provide benefits downstream. So of course, rivers and creeks don't know where our city lines are, but if you're going to be protecting your own infrastructure in your community, just know that that has ripple effects downstream for other communities as well. So Dave will talk more about the economics of benefits in this next section, but I wanted to mostly just set us up with some definitions and some ecosystem level thinking here. And I'll take any questions now, or I'll be hanging around in the chat too.
Great. Yes, if you have questions for Kate, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll also have a Q&A session later on as well. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, thank you.
With that, I'm going to pass it to Dave Ritter with the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. He's going to be talking about the economic benefits of healthy riparian areas, floodplains, and wetlands. So I will pass it to you, Dave.
All right, thank you, Kim. Again, Dave Ritter, Manager of Watershed Technical Support with the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. I'm going to turn this presentation a little bit on its head. While we'll talk about the economic benefits, I also want to look at some of the economic impacts of not having riparian and wetland buffers. So next slide. So the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District is a wastewater and stormwater utility serving 63 member communities across Cuyahoga, Summit, a little bit of Lorain, and a little bit of Lake County. The majority of our region developed prior to stormwater management regulations, resulting in extensive hydraulic and hydrologic modifications to our stream network. Early in the stormwater program, the district invested in stormwater master plans to identify flooding, erosion, and water quality issues in the regional stormwater system. So we define the regional stormwater system as those streams draining more than 300 acres generally. So looking at those larger stream channels, those studies identified more than $1.4 billion worth of projects. So there's definitely an economic impact to not implementing stream and riparian buffers. Since 2015, the stormwater program has invested more than 190 million in various projects across the region. Next slide. For those in our region, unfortunately, these are some familiar images. So as Kate pointed out, the loss of riparian areas can lead to a reduction in water quality, loss of floodplain storage, increased erosion and habitat loss within the stream channel itself, and then also the riparian habitat and loss of carbon storage in those forests that are adjacent to our streams. It also leads to maintenance issues because there's a lack of access to these channels because of private development. It makes it very hard to go in and do any sort of repairs just because there's so many encroachments along the stream. And also that natural stream migration is arrested in a lot of places by hard armoring, just because they're trying to protect those assets along the stream channel. So the preservation of riparian areas and those ecosystem services allows the stream to adjust and move without impacting assets. Next slide, please. So I did a quick Google search to look at some studies to kind of determine what the economic benefits are related to the conservation of natural riparian areas. The one study, the economic value of riparian buffers in the Delaware, determined that buffers provide over $10,000 per acre per year in ecosystem and other related community benefits. The study also stated that in the Puget Sound watershed, restoration projects cost at least 10 times more than the conservation of that area or the conservation projects within that watershed. In addition, restoration projects may not be successful in reestablishing all of those lost ecosystem services due to physical or budgetary constraints. So if folks are looking for some studies to pass along information related to the benefits, these were a few good ones that I found. Next slide, please. So I'd like to walk you through a case study in urban restoration. This was a district project, and you can see as we step through the slides here how hydromodification of our stream channels is difficult and expensive to fix. Next slide. The West Creek project area is located in Brooklyn Heights, Ohio, near the intersection of I-480 and I-77. So if you happen to be at Topgolf, take a look to the northwest and you'll be able to get an idea of where our project lies. West Creek is a tributary to the Cuyahoga River, and at this point, at the lower end of our project, drains about 10.5 square miles of developed watershed. The project goals include trying to bring back some of those lost ecosystem services into the project reach and also to protect the adjacent infrastructure. Next slide. Next slide, please. So looking at a topo map from the 1950s of our project area, West Creek followed a meandering path within a broader floodplain valley that was approximately 400 feet wide. Next slide. Even in the 50s, there was some impact along the channel. There was some agriculture and some rural residential development. But basically, the meandering West Creek existed within that broad floodplain valley. Next slide. By the late 70s, West Creek had been impacted by the construction of transportation assets as well as development. The site plan shows a proposed relocation of the channel to the North Valley Wall to allow for a future commercial development. And you can see from the inset how that meandering natural channel was replaced with a straightened channel to allow that development to occur. Next slide. By the late 80s, the conversion of the natural channel to more of a conveyance channel was complete. So Granger Road was constructed on the north side of the valley and kind of encroached those valley walls. I-480 was constructed to the south. West Creek was straightened and culverted to get underneath I-480 and also to make the right angle bend there at the downstream end of the project. A flume was constructed. Lancaster Road was built across West Creek to serve a subdivision south of I-480 there. And the business park was nearing completion in the late 80s. And that was really kind of the nail in the coffin for this section of West Creek as it pushed that stream right up against that North Valley Wall. And also there's a little landfill there to the east end of our project, which also further constricted that stream channel. Next slide. So by constricting and straightening the channel, severe erosion began soon after the relocation as the stream attempted to adjust to the new flow conditions. In addition, upstream development was occurring and unmitigated stormwater flow coming from the new development led to more volume and higher velocities within the channel. And the combined effect was an unraveling of the bed and banks of West Creek through the project reach. During the 2000s, there were repeated attempts to stabilize the stream, but limited funding and extreme flow conditions ultimately led to the failure of some of those restoration practices, which brings us to our most recent project. Next slide. Next slide, please. So the following photos show evidence of downcutting and lateral erosion that threatens infrastructure and washed away in-stream habitat, making it difficult for fish migration. District studies showed that 50% reduction in the number of species above the project reach as compared to below the project. Next slide. Stormwater outfalls and general bank failures occurred, again, due to this bank erosion as that stream channel is trying to adjust to its new flow regime. Next slide. Emergency projects were needed to protect infrastructure, and the previously installed erosion control practices were beginning to fail as well. So again, this channel is just showing more and more signs of unraveling. Next slide. These are some photos of the ODOT flume, which protects the I-480 embankment and had reached the end of its useful life and was also failing. So again, this shows a stream system that's out of equilibrium and continuing to try to adjust to its new conditions after 30 years of channel modifications and encroachments. Next slide. All right, we'll jump to the next slide, please. So the current district project utilized a raised grade approach by filling in the channel and bringing that channel bottom up between 1 and 6 feet, allowing for fish passage and widening of the flood prone width to attempt to reduce velocities through this section of West Creek. And while the flood prone area was expanded during the project, there just isn't enough room to make a substantial difference during large events, and the reach has to be resistive to the 100-year flow volumes and velocities since it's so constrained within that new channel. Next slide. While the final figures are still being calculated, the project design costs were about $2 million. Land acquisition costs for easements were around $500,000, and the construction costs will be around $14 million by the time this project is done. So there's definitely some economic impacts going back into a reach like this and trying to restore that section and provide stabilization and erosion control. Next slide. So if we flip back to the earlier slide, I wanted to run some numbers on this project just to get a sense of the overall cost to the Northeast Ohio community. Next slide, please. First, I took a look at conservation versus restoration. Thinking back to the Puget Sound study, which found restoration costs were at least 10 times the amount that conservation projects cost. I went back in time to look at land values of a similar piece of property, a floodplain along the Cuyahoga, and what it would have taken to preserve the corridor. The oldest valuation in the auditor's database was from 1996, but even using those numbers, calculated 45 acres of riparian area. So that was the length of the project times a 300-foot width buffer. To preserve that in 1996 dollars would have been about $600,000. So using the current project cost, the restoration was close to 26 times the cost of conservation. And again, without fully realizing all of the lost ecosystem services. Next, I used the Delaware River study value of $10,000 per acre per year of lost ecosystem services. And using 1975 as a starting point, when the stream first began to be impacted, the region experienced over $22 million in lost services based on the Delaware study. Next slide, please. Ultimately, the modification of West Creek has cost the region significant dollars. And while arguably I-480 and the business park have provided economic benefits to the region, the question remains, knowing what we know now, were there more sustainable development alternatives that could have preserved the ecosystem functions of West Creek's riparian buffer? So as we develop our last remaining natural areas, we have to ask ourselves this question repeatedly and look for more sustainable development practices or face the future consequences and expenses of not implementing riparian and wetland setbacks. So that's the end of my presentation. So I don't know if anyone has any questions right off the bat, or I will be around later as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. If anyone has questions for Dave, feel free to put them in the chat. And like I mentioned before, we'll also have a Q&A session in a little bit. My name is Kim Brewster Shuffleton. I work with Chagrin River Watershed Partners, and I'm just going to give a high-level overview of riparian and wetland setbacks and how they work. Again, most of the communities represented here today already have setbacks on the book, so this is just a refresher on what these are, how they generally work for communities across Ohio. And taking another, quick step back into zoning itself, as many of us know, zoning is the way a local government controls the physical development of land and the uses of property. Zoning is designed to protect the welfare of a community by allowing desired development in appropriate locations and prohibiting undesirable development in other locations. Zoning is really a way for a community to implement its comprehensive plan. So riparian setbacks are a zoning tool that communities can use that help maintain those free riparian functions that Kate and Dave described as communities are growing and as land is developed or redeveloped. So riparian setbacks control the location of soil disturbing activities within the riparian zone, and they're really similar to front and side yard setbacks that can be flexed with other setbacks to allow the riparian setback to be maintained without making lots unbuildable. Riparian setbacks are not intended to prevent development, but really to find the best location for development on a particular property. So Chagrin River Watershed Partners has developed a model riparian setback code that can be tailored and adopted by communities that wish to maintain those free benefits that are provided by healthy riparian areas. Our model code does establish a minimum setback width that controls the location of soil disturbance on a parcel. The minimum setback widths in our model code range from 25 to 300 feet on both sides of a watercourse, depending on the watercourse drainage area. Our model code also extends the setback to include wetlands and the FEMA designated 100-year floodplain. So specific setback requirements really vary by community, so your community's requirements might look different. Pamela Davis of NOACA is going to be discussing variations in code requirements across communities in the Northeast Ohio region a little bit later. In addition to riparian wetlands, isolated wetlands also provide a lot of benefits for stormwater management. So we also have a model wetland setback code, which requires areas around wetlands to be preserved in their natural state. The wetland category is determined by Ohio EPA's wetland quality assessment methods, and Category 2 wetlands being your moderate quality wetlands, and Category 3 wetlands being your highest quality wetlands, having different setback widths. So in terms of why did we decide upon those widths in our model code, we did base those widths on available technical and scientific data and with the guidance of local, state, and federal agency partners. I threw some of that data on the screen there. If you're interested in taking a deep dive into that, into how we developed our model code widths, you can check out a document on our website. There's a link there to point you to that to take a little deeper dive into that. You'll see a lot of images like this today, but just reinforcing that the wider the buffer that you keep in a natural, healthy, vegetated state, the more services that are going to be protected for your community. So in terms of determining the presence and extent of setbacks in the field, again, the setback requirements vary by community. In CRWP's model code for small streams that drain less than half a square mile, setbacks apply when there is a defined bed and bank. So defined stream bed, that's typically an area that's free of vegetation due to flowing water. It's defined by rock and sediments of varying sizes, all the way from big boulders to small particles like sand and silt. And setbacks in our model code are measured outward from the ordinary high water mark. That's the point of the bank or shore where the presence and action of surface water is so continuous that it leaves a district that's marked by erosion, destruction or prevention of woody terrestrial vegetation, predominance of aquatic vegetation, or other easily recognized characteristics. And so that ordinary high water mark really defines the bed of the water course. And again, requirements will vary quite a bit by community. That was just an overview of our model code and how we handle where setbacks are delineated from. So in terms of riparian setback mapping, many communities develop a riparian setback map as a guide for setback implementation in their communities. The map uses the best available data and can show streams where we anticipate the applicability of setbacks and anticipated setback widths. It's important to note that these maps are a helpful resource, but field conditions always prevail. Typically, developers are required to delineate setback widths and water bodies when they're submitting their development plans to a community. It is not the responsibility of the community to delineate setbacks for every property when adopting a riparian setback code. And communities can really rely on other natural resource professionals that are available to them, such as your county soil and water conservation districts, local watershed organizations, or other types of technical experts. So in terms of prohibited and permitted and prohibited uses, CRWP's model riparian setback ordinance describes permitted uses within the riparian setback, also conditional uses or activities that are allowed with a permit, and then also activities that are prohibited in the setback area unless a variance is granted. So your community's code may vary from this list. I'm just showing this list as an example. So typically, prohibited uses would be subject to the zoning process, meaning that if someone has a project where a prohibited use is proposed in the riparian setback area, they'll be able to come into the Planning and Zoning Commission or the BZA to discuss their request, ask for a variance, and look at other potential options. Again, the goal would be to identify the best possible project with minimum impact to that riparian area. In most communities' codes, structures that are already located within the setback at the time of adoption of that code are grandfathered in. So typically those structures can be maintained or repaired, but should not be changed or enlarged. And the community's existing regulations regarding non-conforming structures and variances apply. So I encourage you to refer to that section of your code. We've had this question come up, so I added it here. Do non-conforming structures remain non-conforming if the property changes ownership? Thought that was an interesting question. It is our understanding that non-conforming structures do not lose that status due to change in property ownership alone, but again, refer to your individual community regulations about non-conforming structures and variances. So what is the purpose of the variance as a zoning tool? We're going to revisit this in our second hour of our workshop in terms of how to handle variance requests, but just in terms of an overview here, variances or exceptions for prohibited uses within the setback may be granted by the community if they decide that the application of the zoning regulation would result in a practical difficulty or an unnecessary hardship due to the unique characteristics of the property that differentiate it from other properties in that zoning district. So zoning codes, they're an excellent and cost-effective tool for protecting healthy riparian zones and all the free services that they provide to a community. However, they are, imperfect tools, and no zoning code can anticipate all future development circumstances. So variances are really, essential to the proper functioning and administration of a zoning code. There are two different types of variances that relate to riparian and wetland setbacks. The use variance being exceptions for the use of a property that is not normally permitted in a specific zoning district. For use variances, you must demonstrate that denial of that variance would result in unnecessary hardship that is not self-imposed by that landowner or the applicant. And these are usually pretty rare variances, and they may not be allowed in all communities and all community types. So just something to note there. Area variances allow exceptions to dimensional zoning requirements such as setbacks, like riparian and wetland setbacks, or height requirements or other types of dimension requirements. And for area variances, the applicant must demonstrate that denial of that variance would result in a practical difficulty, which deprives the landowner of a permitted use of the property. And so it is a less stringent standard than that unnecessary hardship. A factor that I described earlier. So examples of practical difficulties might be the inability to build a standard house due to steep slopes or the irregular shape of a property. So a community should really consider the potential harm or reduction in riparian functions that can be caused by a proposed structure or use. The community really needs to ensure that a variance is not going to be contrary to the public interest and that the variance is consistent with the spirit and the original intent of that zoning code. The community may choose to require special conditions for the variance to be granted to that applicant. That could include things such as requiring a gravel driveway instead of hardscaping, or requiring the installation of native plants to improve the vegetated buffer between a driveway and a riparian setback. So those are just a couple of examples of conditions that could be applied to allowing that variance. Um, and the community should really be aware of setting a precedent for future variance requests that could come down the line. So our model code does offer guidelines for a community to help them determine the appropriateness of a variance request. They're listed here. It could include whether that property is located in the 100-year floodplain, or how much that proposed variance is going to impair flood control, erosion control, or water quality protection. And your community may list similar guidelines in your riparian and wetland setback codes. Chad Edgar with Lake Soil and Water Conservation District will speak a little bit more to this later on, but again, this is just an overview. So in terms of flexing other setbacks, our model has provisions for providing variances to other setbacks. First, such as side yard, front, rear setbacks, and so forth, to really make sure that lots can remain buildable while also maintaining the riparian setback. Again, the idea here would not be to prevent development, but to find the best location for development on that property. So the photo here is depicting a property in a community with riparian setbacks where a variance was granted to reduce the front yard setback from 100 feet to 70 feet in order to maintain the riparian setback in the rear of the property. So that's an example of other setbacks being flexed to really uphold that full riparian setback width. So riparian setbacks are an important local zoning tool because they help maintain the free services of riparian areas that we discussed earlier. They also lower costs to residents and communities by keeping homes and infrastructure and other property out of the path of ever-changing streams without decreasing property values too. Riparian setbacks are also a best management practice recommended by Ohio EPA and other agencies. And then finally, protection of riparian areas really only occurs at the local level. So state and federal agencies regulate activities within the stream channel itself, but these agencies are not responsible for maintaining the function of riparian areas. So that's that protection is really it really occurs at that local level. So we're focusing on riparian and wetland setback codes today, but there are other natural resource protections your community might consider adopting into your local codes. The decisions about development are really based on the local government level in Ohio. So local governments determine where development happens, how stormwater management happens, how protection of streams and wetlands and other resources like historic resources or scenic resources, how those protections happen. And so CRWP has developed a suite of model codes or code language that helps our member communities protect watersheds as those communities are growing. So these are available on our website, and we're happy to discuss any and all of those codes with you in more detail if you're interested. And as just one example of one of these other codes, we do have a model code for conservation development, which is another type of zoning tool that allows residential or even commercial development while still protecting the area's environmental features, really allowing for more open space and protecting farmland and protecting that rural character of communities. In a nutshell, conservation developments usually site homes on smaller lots, and there's less emphasis on minimum lot size. However, the total number of homes or density on a given acreage does not necessarily increase over that which would be allowed in traditional subdivision designs. So the same number of homes is clustered on a smaller portion of the total available land. The remaining land, which would have been allocated to individual home sites, is now converted converted into protected open space and shared by the residents of the subdivision and maybe even the entire community. So conservation development, again, not a focus of today's workshop, but this is just another example of a zoning tool for your community to consider. And we're glad to talk with you about it if you're interested. So with that, I will pause there. If anybody has any questions, feel free to add those to the chat. And I'm going to hand it over to Pamela Davis with Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency to give an update on the riparian setback legislative review for the NOACA region.
Thanks, Kim. Good afternoon, everyone. And you can go to the next slide, please. So just a quick overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about NOACA. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I do need to set the background for why we're undertaking the 2024 riparian setback legislation update review. Many of you may know about the community riparian wetland guidance brochure that's been out there that helps communities understand the value of riparian setbacks and the need for communities to adopt those. And then many of you may be familiar with NOACA's 2012 legislative review that looked at communities and what types of setbacks they actually adopted. And that was really focused on 36 communities. Where I want to spend the bulk of our time is on our 2024 research and results, and then some community examples that we've identified. And then we have some research observations that are going to be of interest. Next slide, please. Many of you know that we are the Metropolitan Planning Organization. We are also an area-wide agency for water quality and air quality. So we undertake all of the regional planning efforts for Lorain, Cuyahoga, Geauga, Lake, Lorain, Medina. Next slide, please. Just sharing our vision statement, the work that we're working on with the riparian setback helps to advance our efforts to strengthen the regional cohesion and actually enhance the quality of life in Northeast Ohio. Next slide, please. So many of you, as I've already mentioned, many of you may be familiar with this brochure. It was originally designed by the Northeast Ohio Regional Stormwater Task Force. Obviously, you see many of the speakers' names listed here as members that were contributing to this document, really based on some of the model code research Chagrin River Watershed Partners put together. I do need to mention that this was originally funded through Ohio EPA and US EPA through the Great Lakes National Program Office. I know for a long time these were hot items and communities really liked them. And so we're trying to build upon what we've been sharing in a consistent message throughout, the last 20 years. Next slide, please. These should look familiar because Kim actually just went over those. And so the idea is we're wanting communities to adopt specific distances of feet from the stream for different sizes of watersheds. And so this is the regional recommendation. So 25 feet for less than a half square mile watershed size, up to 300 feet for watersheds that are greater than 300 square feet. The regional guidance also includes recommendations for setbacks for category 2 and 3 wetlands. Obviously, these are our higher quality wetlands. When we talk about category 2 and 3, these are really the ones that provide habitat for endangered and threatened species. They're really the old growth forests. And so these are the ones that we want to protect. And so you can see the setbacks for that for those categories. Next slide, please. If you review the brochure provides you some images about, what do we mean when we mean riparian setbacks? We've seen visions, just ideas. One of the things that the regional recommendations call for is if your setback along your stream is smaller than the actual 100-year floodplain, the recommendation is to extend that setback to include the outer boundary of the floodplain. Also, if there's an adjacent wetland to the stream, we want the outer boundary of that wetland to be the extent of the setback. Next slide, please. So this is the spreadsheet that actually generated some pie charts that you'll see coming up. But the idea is NOACA looked at 36 pretty much phase 2 communities to assess their riparian setbacks, kind of in comparison with the regional recommendations. So we looked at, what year was the regulation or the code adopted. We provided a hyperlink. In some cases, we asked if the legislation actually provided appeals or a variance process, and then some other notes. So just 36 communities. Next slide, please. So these results really just represent those 36 communities. And if you're aware of that list, many of them, the majority of them, had actually adopted setback, some distance of a setback width. They actually identified and followed the the recommendations of the regional for the half square mile. The maximum setback distances we also talked about. If your stream is larger, you really want to go bigger to protect those valuable resources. So these pie charts are just indicative of those 36 slides and the results that we saw. Now, if you look at the communities that included the adjacent wetlands, the majority of them, 80%, included the adjacent wetland, as did almost 90% include the 100-year floodplain. So those 36 were kind of the leaders in our region. Next slide, please. We also looked at the additional setbacks, if they included additional regulations and language for category 1 through 3. And you can see that, some did, some didn't. So the idea is we really would like to see additional setbacks adopted for categories 2 and 3 wetlands. Next slide, please. So this is the 2024 NOACA's effort to update that 2012 research project. This time we looked at all 165 communities in the NOACA region. We've estimated there's 125 communities that are considered municipal separate storm sewer communities, and they're required to have a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit for their stormwater system. And we looked at the communities to really dive deep and assess those communities who actually adopted a standalone riparian setback regulation, and it wasn't part of another portion of their code. Maybe part of their open space or maybe part of their plan unit development. Again, we identified the year they adopted it and we provided a hyperlink. And so next slide, please. The ultimate result that we'll have is a spreadsheet for each county that kind of provides and summarizes the data that we'll show you in the next couple of pie charts, but also provides a link to the community's ordinance or zoning regulation if a community wants to look at it in some detail to understand and do a lessons learned. Next slide, please. So when we look at all 165 communities, only 38% have adopted some form of riparian setback, a standalone riparian setback regulation. Next slide. Again, if we assess those 165 communities and we look, what is the minimum setback with the majority of these communities that they adopted? And they followed the guidance and they adopted a minimum setback of 25 feet for the drainage area of less than half a square mile. When we look at the maximum setback width and the associated drainage area, we have about 11% that adopted our 300 setback as the maximum setback. And then we have folks that actually applied it to drainage areas that are greater than 300 square miles and some that applied it to less than 300 square miles. We also then assessed again whether the regulation included the adjacent wetland, and 21% of the 165 did, and 34% actually included the 100-year floodplain in the outer setback boundary. Next slide, please. Again, we only looked this time to see if there were category 2 and 3 additional setbacks adopted. And so for category 3, only 13% adopted the 120-foot setback, 13 adopted a 50% setback. And then with category 2, again, this would be the recommendation from the region would be a shorter, smaller setback. 13% adopted a 75% and 6% adopted a 50 setback. Some folks, 7% adopted a 30-foot setback. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk about community examples. I think this is where folks will find the most value. We can look at pie charts and spreadsheets all day long, but North Royalton, in their establishment of riparian setbacks and wetland setbacks regulations, they adopted the regional recommendations, basically carte blanche. They followed the brochure and they followed Chagrin River Watershed Partners recommendations. They also adopted additional distances for setbacks when steep slopes were in play. So if a riparian area, if it was a drainage area, they would have a baseline setback, but if there was a slope of 15 to 20%, they would add another 25 feet to it. If it was greater than 20 and less than 25%, they would add another 50. Understanding the role of steep slopes. Again, North Royalton actually included the adjacent wetlands in the outer setback distance, as well as the 100-year floodplain. Next slide, please. One of the things I'd like to bring to the attention is that in considering variances, North Royalton actually provided some guidance to their Board of Zoning Appeals regarding variance requests. And they actually encouraged the BZA to really consider, is there going to be a loss of riparian or wetland function associated with the variance? And then they further define that function as, flood control, control of soil, sediment control, and other water quality protection. They also encourage the BZA to think about soil types and the existence of natural vegetation, especially within that 100-year floodplain. In addition, they allowed the BZA to vary the front, rear, and side yard setbacks before they vary the riparian or wetland setbacks. And then they actually said no variances for asphalt or concrete paving when porous or gravel pavement can work. Next slide, please. So when we think about this loss of function, the regulations North Royalton adopted actually identify when there is a loss of function, what type of mitigation actually has to happen. And so when there's increased flooding or streambank erosion or sedimentation, mitigation is required at the site or upstream from the site within the same watershed. If there's the potential for biological loss, functions are lost, again, the priority for mitigation is upstream whenever possible, and then downstream if upstream is not possible, and then last, it can happen anywhere in the community. Again, anytime riparian or wetland setback loss is, if there's a loss of the setback, then the amount of the setback loss, 100% of it has to be mitigated. So if the variance says you can have a setback, you can have this variance of 20 feet of the riparian setback, they're going to have to mitigate that at 100%. And then if they actually lose any wetlands, they have to be replaced upstream, hopefully in a disturbed location at a rate of 100%. Next slide, please. So some other community examples, City of Warrensville Heights, they actually added 15 feet, additional setback for steep slopes from 15 to 20% and 25 for slopes greater than 20%. City of Painesville actually looked at their community, looked at their drainage areas, and they actually set 6 different setback distances for the size of their drainage areas. They also adopted a 10-foot setback for Category 1 wetlands. You've heard Kim talk about Chagrin River Watershed Partners model regulations. Auburn, Bainbridge, and Russell Townships all adopted those model codes. Next slide, please. City of Avon actually talks about in their riparian establishment, they talk about designated water courses within the French Creek watershed. They require 50 feet on either side, on each side of French Creek, Mills Creek, and Schwartz Creek, and 25 feet in all the other water courses within the French Creek watershed. Many of you may remember that in the early phase 2 regulations, French Creek watershed was a rapidly developing watershed. City of Wadsworth actually talks about and requires the width of riparian zones to be 10 times the width of the water course. And they reference and use the formula included in Ohio Department of Natural Resources Rainwater and Land Development Manual. And the idea is that they take the most current formula from ODNR and incorporate it into their engineering rules and regulations. Next slide, please. Sheffield Village, interesting. They actually include setbacks as part of their plan unit development criteria. So 50 feet from streams and 20 feet from designated wetlands. Perry Township, they actually established a 150-foot setback on either side of the Grand River and 30 feet on each side of the Red Mill Creek, Red Creek, and Arcola Creek. Leroy and Madison Township, both interesting in that they adopted setbacks for Class 3 primary headwater habitat streams. Leroy, 50-foot setback, and Madison, a 75-foot setback. Really, these are really streams and water areas that cannot be replaced. Next slide, please. So some research observations. We've been dealing with phase 2 stormwater regulations, MS4s, stormwater management plans, stormwater pollution prevention plans. Really the influence of phase 2, I kind of saw a 2-track pattern. Either communities adopted riparian and wetland land use regulations in the way of their setbacks, or they actually identified the function and protection of that function as part of the performance standards for construction activities, which may not be permanent. Next slide, please. In reading these codes, you can see that as the Supreme Court moved back and forth with what the definition of the waters of the United States, you could see that development codes and the adoption was kind of influenced by those changing definitions. Some communities realized that the feds were going to go back and forth, and they just said, okay, we'll have setbacks for surface waters of the state, because the state was actually adopting their own regulations at the time. I think the biggest takeaway in my research observations, when we think about planning, we think about the 10th Amendment and communities' ability to use police power in developing regulations to protect the public health, safety, and general welfare. And I think a lot of the language was kind of missing that focus on, not only are we protecting the value of the riparian area, as Dave Ritter already said, we're protecting the financial economic impacts to the community. Next slide, please. So we are drafted. We're presenting our draft findings. We are working on developing a report. You can find the brochure, the community guidance brochure, and the 2012 review on our webpage. If you're interested in being a peer reviewer for our final document, please contact us. We will be working on that report post-presentation. If there are any mistakes, they're mine. Please let me know. And next slide, please. And I really have to thank NOACA's water quality staff, our intern, Allison Bunce, and our water quality planner one, Sarah Stanzi. This really was a team effort. We built on some work from Marissa McDonald, a former intern. And this is interesting to look through 165 communities. And then I just want to be great. I want to acknowledge Sugar River Watershed Partners for their continued leadership in model zoning. And Kim, Carla, and Jared, thank you so much for your peer review in my early drafts of these materials. Thank you. Next slide, sorry.
Great. Thank you so much, Pam. We do have a couple questions in the chat. The first was in relation to speaking about the regional recommendations for setbacks, and some communities that had variations from those regional recommendations or went above and beyond those. Did you get any feedback of why a community changed from the model regulations?
But I did not actually get anecdotal information about, did they adopt additional regulations? But that's something maybe we should think about in going back to the original 36 and the 165 and see if there were new regulations passed, and then compare the two if possible. It's a good question. Do you know who that was from?
Carla with Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District.
Carla, let's talk.
And then we had a second question in here. How are soil types ascertained when determining appropriate riparian setbacks?
That's a good question, and I'll lead off with you. We can actually look at some of the national land cover data, and we understand certain soils have better, ability to hold water, retain water, and support vegetation. I think when you look at construction sites, they're going to be doing sampling of soils to think about supports, what that soil can support. You know, I'll defer to my soil and water conservation folks because that is their job.
If anyone else has any input to add there, please do. And if anyone else has other questions for the chat, please enter them now for Pam.
Kim, this is David Atchie, Lake County Planning. I do know that like our subdivision not our subdivision, our GIS has soil data on it, and that's was done by the USDS, I think USDS a couple of years ago, back in the 70s. And so we have the entire county has different soil types, but that's not site specific. Every time that we do a subdivision, we have the developers do their own soil testing. They do go out and do bores, and then they have their engineers and their surveyors map out the site, the soils the developments. But that's for a major subdivision. If you're just putting up a shed or if you're doing something smaller, you're not going to be able to get that kind of information. So you'd be more dependent on the GIS data and the county-wide soil types.
Dave, that's a great addition. Again, when we look at the national land cover data, it's not site specific, but it will help you understand your soils in your watershed. Also, it will help you with some slopes as well. Thanks, Mr. Ritter, for putting in the NRCS soil survey. And NOACA, as part of our Clean Water 2020 plan, we've been downloading national land cover data for the 5 counties and the watersheds that drain through them. And we are working on updating our layers of land cover and slope cover for the region. The multi-resolution consortium is working on issuing them. They were issuing them every 3 years. They're working towards every year now. So that we have data from 2001, 2004, 2006. Most recent one is 2021. I can get in touch with me and I can share more information.
Somebody just posted a question I saw pop up saying, how often does the GIS soils get updated? Not very often. So they're based, the GIS departments are gathering data from other sources and putting them on to the GIS page. So if somebody goes out and updates the soil survey this year, then they'll post that. If not, they're whatever was the last time that they did it. And so I think our original one was done in the 60s, and then it was updated with a digital copy at some point. I just don't know what the date would be on those soils.
Thanks, David.
Sounds like a potential workshop follow-up.
Yes. Great. Well, thank you so much, Pam, for that great information. We will have a lengthier Q&A session later on if you think of more questions, everybody. So with that, we're going to move into a 5-minute break, stretch your legs, get some coffee. We will reconvene back here around 2:17. So please come back in 5 minutes and then we'll resume the workshop. Thanks, everyone. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Next up, we have Brent Eisenbach and Carla Regener with Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District, who are going to speak about considering setbacks during development plan review and approval. And we'll also have David Radacci from Lake County Planning Community Development speaking to this topic as well after Brent and Carla. So I will pass it to you, Brent.
Thanks, everybody. My camera just switched from being on my desktop over to my laptop, so sorry for the oblique angle view. My name is Brent Eisenbach. I'm the Deputy Director for uh, Stormwater and Technical Services at Cuyahoga Soil and Water. And Carla, who's joining us on the presentation, she did help prepare some of these slides, but I'll be doing most of the talking. Slide, please. So the overview today is to talk about these bulleted items, and it's written from the context that you as a participant in this workshop had some interest or responsibility in overseeing the riparian resources in your community, or perhaps you have project review oversight. We'll talk about some of the technical aspects of it, but more so some of the sociological, if you will, aspects of doing a review and just being able to understand all of the administrative minutia that goes into it. As you can see here, it'll be talking to the development staff or your intake staff, understanding the natural resources that are in your community, knowing what the right resources are to engage with, um, understanding if there's supporting regulations, evaluating any viable alternatives. We'll spend a little bit of time on analyzing the constructability, which is something that I think reviewers often overlook. They just look at the blueprints and they don't necessarily understand the human impacts of what a project will look like in the future. We'll touch briefly on variance and mitigation, but one of the presenters that's following up with me or following me will have a little bit more information about that. And finally, follow-up, which is often overlooked, particularly when there's some administrative variances granted. Slide, please. Yep, funny photos here. Striking the balance, right? You as a city staff member, how are you going to get your message across to the other folks in your office? I think you have to strike a balance between being the person with the bullhorn and annoying everybody and trying to then also build a consensus and understanding what the shared values of the community are and how to effectively enable those through the ordinances that are in effect in the community, the review procedures that you have, and then also the people who engage with these projects really early on, making sure they don't overpromise. Particularly affected elected officials and development staff. They come from mixed backgrounds and they're probably not aware of all the various regulations. If you think of who the elected officials are, there's probably not many of them that have natural resources backgrounds. Similarly, those elected officials are appointing planning commissioners or economic development staff that have specialized skill sets in exactly what they're doing, seeking out development opportunities for the community. And oftentimes they're not focused on the natural resource protection of that area. So find that way to provide the incremental education and not be that annoying coworker. Whether it's quarterly, whether it's providing training on some sort of routine basis with those folks, or simply attending, the council meetings or the subcommittee meetings in order to get your points across. On the other side of that, you have the longtime city workers who are the project staff intake. They also need training. They might be equipped with checklists. They may understand what a riparian zone is, but do they know who to route it to? Do they know how long, do they know how much administrative time it's going to take to do this review and what sort of administrative time there would be related to variances? So they're not trying to rush these projects through on emergency measures as we see a lot of councils doing these days. It seems like everything that gets passed is an emergency ordinance. Could these project intake staff benefit from having fail safes in place, a defined overlay district that the council could put together to say these are our sensitive natural areas within the community, a parcel list that is defined so that when someone comes in to uh, have an application for a fence, a deck, a shed, anything like that, um, can that parcel then be flagged? Having flow charts, scripts, and FAQs for those intake staff are also important as well. Slide, please. This one's an important one. It's what is the state of the natural resources in your community? And I often like to use the phrase a running estimate. Um, it's important for people who are engaged with the review process to know the state of the natural resources. You can imagine us at Cuyahoga Soil and Water to some effect. We have to have a general idea of what are the sensitive natural resource areas, the streams, riparian wetland areas within Cuyahoga County, or at least the communities that we work in. And that's a really large geographical area. Similarly, if you break that down into smaller pieces, each municipality in Cuyahoga County has a little bit smaller to deal with that. But there are some communities, for example, Beechwood, that I think has 4 watersheds that touch the city of Beechwood. So there's a lot to juggle and maintain here. And if you maintain a running estimate of what's going on, you'll at least be able to know when a project's being developed that there should be some sort of an enhanced investigation associated with that. Um, or if you're thinking that maintaining all of that in your head is not sufficient, harken back to what I just said about having overlay districts or a parcel list where these resources exist and can be flagged for that enhanced review. Um, what are the sizes of the contributing drainage areas? We know, as an example, in Independence, there's a lot of the city of Independence, Ohio. There's a lot of small streams that run down the valley sidewall that don't have really large contributing drainage areas. However, in the next town over, in Parma, for example, really large watersheds with contributing drainage areas that far exceed multiple square miles. So again, create these tools that will help you understand and track this information. Um, it could be using GIS to create a layer that identifies where the riparian wetland areas are in proximity to land that could be developed. Um, so it's also, as a reviewer, knowing what's left in your communities. At least in Cuyahoga County, there's less and less land every year upon which developers can develop upon, but there is also opportunities for redevelopment. And then balancing that with, again, what are the values of your community? If a piece of property came up for redevelopment that was previously grandfathered in, would you let that non-conforming use stand, or would you seek for that redevelopment to adhere to the riparian and wetland ordinances that maybe are on the books now rather than when it was originally developed, maybe back in the 50s, 60s, or 70s? Um, Also know what areas of land that are currently developed upon um, may need to have some sort of intervention in the future. Service directors are always going to get complaints of my backyard is eroding or the stream is encroaching on my shed, things like that. And if you continue to keep track of those parcels and those assets and those complaints, it can start to develop a picture for you of where the problem areas are and what that may mean in the future as those parcels get redeveloped or come up for development downstream. Slide, please. This one's pretty straightforward. You'd think gathering the review resources, there's checklists out there, the Ohio EPA, when you're reviewing a stormwater pollution prevention plan, which seems to be where a lot of this riparian and wetland investigation comes into play requires a checklist now that it demonstrates that the community is not just haphazardly stumbling through a review, but is doing it in a systematic method. Technical publications that are out there, permits, as Pam mentioned, the definition of waters of the state has been a moving target for about 10 years, and it'll probably continue to be a moving target for a while. And that includes both federal waters and state waters or isolated wetland permits. It keeps changing. And as a reviewer, you need to change along with that and be up to date. Ordinances, knowing which ordinances within your community relate to the various projects that you're working on. Um, Back to the elected officials and the economic development officials, have there been any community-specific agreements that were put in place as a part of this development, whether it's a mitigation or an enhancement of the riparian zones or a trade-off of space from one area to another? So like offsite mitigation, for example. And then finally, what are the technical resources that you have? Someone put in the chat earlier using web soil survey to understand the soils that are out there. USGS, stream stats, which is this photo in the lower left-hand corner, to be able to delineate what is the contributing watershed. There's a lot of resources out there, and you need to make sure that you are aware of those resources to be able to properly do your review in an efficient manner. Slide. And if it wasn't just enough to gather your resources, you also need to know what all the cross references are in the supporting regulations. This is an excerpt from one community's riparian wetland setback. And as we can see here, it also references the sediment and stormwater runoff, the hillside zone regulations, which is a separate chapter, the flood hazard control areas, which is a separate chapter. 1380 here is again the erosion and sediment control. And then down at the bottom, we have chapter 698, which is um, the enforcement codes associated with this. Um, there's probably also separate codes in here that reference the variance process and so forth. So it's not just being able to identify what is controlling this, but then what are the onion peel effects, if you will, like as you get deeper into here, into the review and start to uncover that maybe there's a proposed encroachment. Are they properly mitigating? I mentioned hillside. There's a little graphic about hillside, and Pam spent a good amount of time talking about that, and that demonstrates um, it's a visual representation of where it is. So being able to move that 25-foot buffer, if you will, further out based on the size of the hill. The lower photo there is if there's adjacent wetlands in the stream side zone, it's moving that riparian limit out to incorporate those adjacent wetlands. Slide, please. Are there viable alternatives? This isn't, again, a discussion about conservation development, which could be a workshop all unto itself. But oftentimes, uh, the zoning code, which regulates the frontage, the lot depth, and so forth, can be at odds with the riparian and wetland zones codes. And so it's understanding before a project comes before your community about what are the values of that community. Is the value maintaining a particular frontage and a particular aesthetic to the neighborhood, or is the value of the community and maintaining the natural resources of the area? I can tell you that a few years ago, there was a community in which a large parcel had come onto the market that had not previously been on the market for quite a while. So it wasn't really on anybody's running estimate or their radar. And it was chock full of wetlands. And it looked like it was going to be a pretty complicated project to develop if there were wetlands. During a conversation with the city engineer, I'd asked about whether they considered conservation development, and this engineer was adamant that that's not the type of look that they wanted for their community. So that's the value judgment, if you will, of that community. and for better or for worse, it should be respected. And ultimately, it did not get developed in the manner that you'd see on the left, where it was just large parcels and a lot of mitigation. Um, they found a person who was interested in owning the entire property for themselves, if you will, and then that person built in just a small corner of the property and avoided most of the natural resources that were associated with it. So um, that's one method, but I think that that's a pretty exceptional method of having a person come in and buy up such a large parcel. I think it was, more than 20 acres when they did that. Slide, please. Is the project constructible and is the project livable? And I'll spend a little bit of time on these photos. The top two photos are essentially looking at the same parcel, looking at the same building, if you will. This was a project in a community where there was a large wooded parcel and streams running through it and associated wetlands. And the community was wanting this residential subdivision to happen. Um, the regulations that were in place within that community would have meant that the developer needed to lose a couple of buildable lots in order to adhere to all the uh, project setbacks. And the developer said that that would not support the margins for their development. So they got into a bit of a negotiation with the community. The community asked for our help. And in terms of looking at that, we determined that there were probably some wiggle room here and there to massage those riparian buffer boundaries with the implementation of on-site mitigation. So reforestation of the uh, riparian buffers that were to remain and the wetlands that were to remain. It was a very good project in the sense that it happened early. There was a very transparent conversation and negotiation, and then everything was pretty well documented before the plat was ever signed. Um, and then we got to this point here where uh, the developer handed over the lots to the home builder, and a home builder went and built a bathroom window around a tree branch, as you can see in this upper left-hand photo. And only after they built the wall in the house did they call soil and water back out to say, hey, look, the tree's a little too close. What can we do here? And, at that point, this is the question of, is the project constructible? And on the page, it looks like it is. But in reality, what you can see here in the upper right-hand photo is that the original riparian buffer boundary, which is the orange silt fence, which is kind of collapsed and not in good shape, was danger close to the house. And it really was kind of unbuildable. And this tree that should have been preserved, which was inside the riparian buffer, was now projecting through the window of this bathroom. So obviously the tree needed to be um, removed, and we went out and negotiated with that developer then to provide a certain number of caliper inches in replacement for that again additional tree that needed to be taken down, and they went about building their house. What you can see here, the two trees where the orange silt fence kind of skirted around them. That was the builder being a little bit slick, seeing if they could just exclude two trees by, putting the silt fence on one side versus the original boundary, which was surveyed and installed properly. So we had to call them out about that. So it's understanding the constructability aspect of it, and also understanding about whether or not the values of the community would have allowed this building footprint to be moved maybe 10 feet closer to the sidewalk than what is permitted by zoning, rather than maintaining that front yard setback and bumping into this sort of situation. Because as you can imagine, even after the building and the house was constructed and the silt fence was gone and the grass was stabilized here, you're still going to have that homeowner mowing around the side of their house, planting beds, and possibly encroaching into that wetland area. This lower right photo is, it's not the same home, but it demonstrates the same concept here um, is this house livable? If that red line, which is the buffer line, is supposed to be the kind of no-go zone for the homeowner, can that homeowner effectively um, live with that? Or has the real estate agent properly identified that to them? Or will this now become a hassle and a headache for the community moving forward, having to deal with complaints and encroachments? Slide. This is a photo that you've already seen during Kate's presentation. A little bit more background to this has to deal with the way that codes are written and having that running estimate of the natural resources in your area. In this particular community, the ordinance was written that this particular stream required a 25-foot setback from the ordinary high water mark, and the ordinary high water mark of this particular development was actually about 2 feet or 3 feet off the edge of that escarpment, if you will. So this project, this is a brand newly built project, was given the green light go ahead to build that close to the edge of the eroding bank because the actual riparian buffer was about 3 feet from the top of that eroded embankment. Um, and I'll leave it to your imagination about what sort of issues that this development will experience in the future if it was just built on typical um, building methods without piles or anything like that to reinforce the embankment. So in this circumstance, a community that didn't really think that they had steep slopes that wouldn't have um, envisioned themselves as being a community with steep slopes or needing to have a steep slope ordinance associated with their riparian and wetland setbacks does truly indeed have steep slopes because of the erosion from higher storm events and more impervious surface over time eroding this channel down in the method that it is. So thinking about preservation, variance, and mitigation as we move forward here. Slide, please. A couple of examples that we're going to go into. I've got three of them. This one is from a community where uh, a generally naturalized parcel in the middle of their business district came up for sale. You can see in that center photo there was a little homestead, and they owned quite a large uh, parcel of wooded area back there. On the left, um, this community has good riparian and wetland setbacks. And the pink shadowing here shows what the setbacks look like overlaid on top of the proposed development plan. It was for a senior living community. So as you can see, they've got the large senior living building to the south, and then they had some of these independent living villas to the north. And in this circumstance, the villas, which probably made this development financially feasible for the developer, would not be feasible for them. So this developer requested a total of 15 variances, which should perk up people's ears. I mean, at what point is too many variances to get a project off the ground? Versus is this a conforming project or does this need to be like a planned unit development? Those are the types of questions when you're um, engaging with those elected officials or the appointed officials to have is what are the values of the community? Do we want to grant every variance that's available on the books, or do we want to work with the developer to work around some of the natural resources? In the blue on the right is after the setbacks and mitigations and the variances were granted, there's still quite a bit of overlap between what is wetland and what is buildable. Slide, please. This is another project in one of the southern suburbs of Cuyahoga County. where land is increasingly more difficult to build upon with steep slopes and ravines and so forth. And what you can see here is that this hillside property was braided with a whole bunch of streams, big and small, going down through it. The larger ones did have setbacks that were identified through the use of their zoning codes. And that's the red line, which is a setback from the far northern blue stream bank there. And then also there's a red line on the bottom, which is a setback from the southern streams. One of the challenges that we've found with this community, though, is that their riparian and wetland ordinance specifically says that a stream needs to show on a USGS map in order to be counted as a stream. And those two streams which run through the middle of the property are not found on a USGS map and are therefore not counted in their riparian and wetland ordinance. So those don't get setback consideration during the plan review. Slide, please. And the result here is that you've got some home properties now that have culverts running underneath of them up and down the entire block. And these water courses are, they have a defined bed and bank, but they did not show up on a USGS map. And so these property owners now will have to deal with the maintenance, the flow, and perhaps the erosion that's going to be associated with that. So again, back to the community with that running estimate, understanding where complaints are coming from, understanding where complaints may come from in the future, and just trying to guard against the future. If this is something that the community wants to deal with, or the council person to the area who may not know about natural resources, but knows a lot about constituent services, is this the conversation you want to have with that elected official in the future about not providing maintenance services to individual property owners when natural resources impact their property versus um, when this project came through, finding an alternative uh, to this type of development that would allow the natural resources to flow through there without presumably causing property damage. Slide, please. And a final example, this is a fairly straightforward, this is more of a wetland issue. You can see here that there's an existing wetland that was mitigated and a riparian setback that was associated with that. So at what point then, when a wetland gets mitigated, does the setback for that get extinguished within the code? And then the riparian zone, which did not get mitigated, then takes supremacy. So it's understanding the layers that are associated with these riparian and wetland mitigations. And in some communities, they also have buffers to those riparian setbacks. So it might be a 25-foot buffer on a 75-foot setback for a whole 100 feet of space. And if some or part of that gets mitigated, how does that buffer and how does that setback shrink? In this case, it's a 3,200 square foot variance that was granted to these property owners that had cut through there. The slide. And this is what the project looks like after it was built. And so again, it's talking about livable space here. To any ordinary homeowner standing on that deck and they look back, what do they think is their parcel boundary? And do they have natural resources or setbacks or exclusionary zones on their property? And how will the property owners be informed of that? Is it going to be a deed restriction on their parcel? Is there going to be a conservation easement put on it? Is it going to be a drainage easement of some sort? But at any rate, we oftentimes find at Cuyahoga Soil and Water that projects like this, people will continue to encroach into this remaining setback area in order to eke out another mower's width of grass, and then another one the next season, and another one the next season, and then they build their fire pit, and pretty soon They're sitting right on top of the natural resources, the wetland area or the riparian zone here, because none of it gets followed up. Slide, please. Which brings me to the point to follow up. Back to the project here with the was it constructible? In the upper left-hand corner, I already told you about these two trees and the developer trying to move the silt fence around there. That's a follow-up item. So after the original negotiation, after the subsequent negotiation, you still have to go back and make sure that the agreed upon boundaries are being enforced. Um, in the upper right-hand corner, we talked about needing to replace a certain number of caliper inches of trees for that one that was removed, in addition to the wetland and riparian setback enhancement for the general variance mitigation that was being provided on this project. Are those trees being planted? Just physically counting up the number and making sure that it's getting done. In the lower left-hand corner, though, it goes beyond just counting up tree tubes, and it means going out and actually looking at these. In this lower left-hand case, what we're seeing here is that more than 50% of the tree tubes that were planted on this project were were rotten and they needed to be replaced again. So not only doing that follow-up, but also making sure that in whatever sort of variance or mitigation agreements that are put into place, that there's performance measures and perhaps performance bonds associated with that. So that way the developer doesn't say, hey, I planted 100, you got what you asked for, and I can't help it if deer come around and eat them or if they rot in the tubes. The lower right-hand corner, when you're working close to streams, of course, there's going to have to be erosion and sediment controls, but then making sure that those erosion and sediment controls are properly being maintained and the resources which are not supposed to be impacted by construction are truly being protected. So it's written here, but I think it's worth saying, don't forget to follow up and then follow up again and then follow up again and then follow up again. Slide, please. So that concludes my portion of it, and I'll send it over to David.
And we did have just a quick question there. I see the one question from Patrick. We'll reserve that for our general Q&A, but the second question there for you, Brent, for your example number one, had a question about the mitigations provided in that first example, and I'll try to go back to that slide.
So the setbacks after the mitigation, this wasn't my project, so I'm not 100% familiar with it.
Brent, do you want me to answer it?
I absolutely do, Carla. Thank you.
Okay. Um, so actually, the image is actually showing that they were mitigating for some wetlands, and that was still, and so they were trying to say that they had a smaller setback for the riparian and wetland setback, because they were going to ultimately mitigate through, those wetlands that they were going to disturb. So the developer was trying to say, hey, this is, this is a smaller impact than it really was. But as far as this property hasn't actually been developed just yet, but it's within the community, they actually do have, because it's a category 2 wetland, they have a 4-to-1 wetland mitigation, so they will have to do some type of mitigation, and it likely probably won't be on the property because there's not enough room. They will probably have to do it off-site, but it'll be at 4-to-1.
Thank you, Carla. And we have another question relevant for your presentation, Brett and Carla. As for the trees, are there any binding obligations that a homeowner or developer would have to actually replant or replace trees that were supposed to be protected, and who would enforce that?
This project is actually just starting to wrap up, and it's actually been a bit of a a hassle to get this project completely across the finish line, if you will, to where you could understand, was everything completed the way that it was supposed to be or not. With regard to the trees, there's no requirement for the homeowners to maintain those. Um, the homeowners association does have those areas as common property on their plat. And um, I don't believe that the homeowners association either has a responsibility to ensure that those were taken care of. So it was a performance measure that was associated with the developer. And as the developer and the builders and the homeowners come to some sort of an agreement on whether this project is complete, that'll definitely be getting addressed to ascertain what the final mortality was and whether any replacements need to be um, installed. But that's a bit of a lesson learned for us. So Sarah, who asked the question, definitely if you're considering mitigation in the sense of an enhancement of the riparian or wetland zones that are to remain, make sure that you absolutely get some solid performance measure language included on the plat, so that way everyone can be held accountable for that.
Thank you, Brent and Carla. Advance again. And then I'm going to hand it over to David Rodacci, the Director of Lake County Planning and Community Development, to provide a little more perspective on development plan review. So take it away, David.
Okay, this is more of not really a development review session. It's just us using riparian setbacks as a design tool as we look at our subdivision, and especially in communities that don't have riparian setbacks in their zoning. Most of our townships, I think all of our townships have the riparian setbacks in them now, so it's not much of an issue as it once was in Lake County, but it was originally a problem. This section is county and township based, so cities have greater authority than what townships and counties do. And subdivision authority and zoning authorities are usually divided in the townships. Counties through the planning commission administer subdivisions and lot splits. And zoning is in the townships are usually through the townships themselves. There is some areas that have county zoning, which is still separate from county subdivision. But in Northeast Ohio, most of the townships handle their own zoning. Slide again. So Lake County Planning Commission decided to add riparian setbacks as a design tool to the subdivision regulations back in 2004. Since then, we've been using riparian setbacks as a design tool to design subdivisions to have the streams and riparian areas in the backyards. This helps protect the streams by having less impact on them. It also helps to protect the houses, the structures, and gym and other structures away from the streams. Some of those images that Brent and Carla were showing that these houses are right up against the streams and that will undermine the foundations, and then it'll be expensive for the homeowner to protect that foundation or in the future, or even to repair that foundation if it gets to that point. These design setbacks were modifications of the Chagrin River Partners' original riparian setbacks. We decided to split up the square miles into smaller square miles to lessen the impact a little bit on the developers, because we originally did get a lot of pushback from the developers when we originally introduced these setbacks. Slide, please. So this is just an image of how far, just a regular lot with the stream in the rear line. So if we use design standards correctly, we will push the streams into the backyard of the property or near the rear line of the lot. And then that will put the setback, repairing the stream into the backyard, which will be covered by the normal rear setback of a house or the side setback. And then the side setback would also push it away from the house also. Slide, please. The new regulation was developed to influence the subdivider to place the land adjacent to the stream to the backyards to help keep the area clear of improvements, keep the houses away from the stream, help protect the houses, help protect the stream. Slide, please. This regulation was designed to reduce the amount of land that was in the building envelope when the lot was adjacent to a stream and not reduce the amount of buildable land in the subdivision. The setback, this is a setback, not a buffer. The owners of the property can still use the land as they see fit. They just cannot put a house into the setback area. We're limited to what we can do in these areas. We can do setbacks, but we can't, after the plat's been filed, we have no authority over the property owner or the subdivider or the home builder. That falls into zoning. So the riparian setback and zoning will keep that better protected than what we could. We're just trying to design the subdivisions better to make sure that the areas at least consider as considered as they do the development of the property. After the subdivisions so that the riparian protects the stream and also protects the home structures and the property. As I said before, some of these images that we are seeing, if we use design setbacks in the subdivision review, we were able to push houses away from the development, away from the stream, and help protect them. Slide, please. So, just a general, this is a piece of property, maybe 10, 20 acres, anywhere in any of the townships. We have a main street, and so we have a stream going through the middle of it. So, if we go with the conventional subdivision, slide, please. We'll end up with two cul-de-sacs with the stream going down the middle. We have culverts in the middle of the road. And we also have, this one has two culverts, and we have the stream going through in the middle of a couple of sublots, at least 3 of them. And that really affects the ability to build on those lots. So we're using riparian setbacks. Can I go to the next slide, please? We'll push that stream into the backyards of various lots. So we can have them have one road go across the development. And so that's one culvert for the township to maintain in the future. We do have a connection in the future for another road to the south to help continue the development. All the lots in these pictures have the stream in the rear lines or on the sidelines, so they're going to fall into the sideline setback if there's no riparian setback. So it helps protect the future homeowners. Helps protect the future homeowners, even if the township doesn't have riparian setback. Slide, please. Riparian, the planning commission can only influence the design of the subdivision and make recommendations to the developer on ways to keep the riparian corridor clear of improvements. After the plat's filed, we don't have any jurisdiction of the riparian setback unless the township has riparian setbacks themselves in their zoning. Zoning takes over at this point. If there's a riparian setback, the zoning inspector will regulate the area. If there isn't a riparian setback, then the zoning inspector will enforce the regular setbacks. Subdivision and zoning are separate township. I'm sorry. Slide, please. There are ways that we can also continue to protect this. We can de-restrict it and put into the homeowner bylaws that they have to have a setback, an easement on top of the riparian setbacks. There are conservation easements that they could sell to various agencies like soil and water conservation districts, the metro parks, other land conservation development districts. That will help also reduce the property taxes on the property and also give, if it's put into a conservation easement, then you have another agency who can come in and make sure that those riparian setbacks are are still clear even after the development has been going forward. We have a couple of developments who have these conservation or deed restrictions, and we have an agency coming through to make sure that the homeowners don't build sheds or put playgrounds or other things into those areas. Dedicated open space, or you can dedicate the open space as part of a park to a local community, to our park board, to a school, or to other government agencies. Things that consider that we've run into in the past as we review these developments. The riparian setbacks in our development standards are not set. There are set in stone, but our information that we use to determine the setbacks aren't. We have what we call the Lake County Gazetteer that was done in the 80s that shows sub watersheds of the smaller streams and gives an area of how many square miles that the stream um, drains. But we've had developers hire their own consulting engineers and do an actual watershed boundary of the stream that's in their development to either prove that it doesn't need a 75-foot setback, it actually needs a 40-foot setback and show us the area that it drains. And so there are other information when you get into site specific, developers can pay their consulting engineers to try to eliminate the setbacks a little bit, and we have to be liable to allow them to do that. Sometimes you get better information than what we have as part of the GIS. As we were talking about before, these soils are countywide in Lake County on the GIS, and the developers will go in and do actual borings, and we can get an actual soil map of the property, and sometimes those two sets of information don't match. So that's all I really have on the subject. So hopefully I didn't go too fast on this.
Oh, thank you so much, David. We do have a question from the chat from Tracy asking about what can be put into a setback, accessory structures, garden, fire pit. I'm kind of looking for examples of what can be put into the setback as it relates to your presentation.
As it relates to my presentation, we don't enforce any accessory structures. So after we file the plat, we don't get involved. Zoning, if there's a riparian setback, they can enforce and keep all the structures out of the riparian setback. Houses, accessory structures, the playgrounds, gazebos or pools or whatever. If there's not a riparian setback, then if accessory structures allowed 3 feet from the rear line, then there can put a structure 3 feet from the rear line. We try to limit as much as we can, but we're not involved in actual enforcement of zoning.
Great. Thank you so much, David. If anyone else has more questions for David, feel free to throw them in the chat or bring them up during our longer Q&A session later on. Thank you, David. With that, going to pass it to Chad Edgar of Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District, who's going to speak a bit about development plan review and how to handle variance requests as well. So take it away, Chad.
Thank you, Kim. We're getting a little behind schedule, so I'm going to talk really fast, which I tend to do when I get excited about stuff anyway. So if I gloss over something, you didn't get it, you didn't hear it, feel free to reach out to me. So soil and water conservation districts are typically not regulatory agencies. We're here to provide technical expertise to landowners and to local municipalities. So if you're thinking about a riparian setback in your community, or if you have one and you're just not sure how to implement it, you don't feel maybe your staff has a technical expertise, you are not alone. Reach out to us. Soil and Water District helps folks with riparian setbacks. with flagging the ordinary high water mark on specific sites. And we will do drainage area calculations for a specific reach. And we also provide comments to BZAs for variance requests. So, how does that look? What does a comments to a BZA look like? I always start with the purpose and intent of that specific community's riparian setback language. And I'm using Concord Township here as an example. And there's three pretty big ones in there. The purpose and intent is to reduce the impacts of flooding, both on that property, but for adjacent properties and throughout the watershed. Assist in stabilizing banks. And again, that's not just a local issue, that can be for upstream and downstream landowners, and also reducing pollutants by filtering them out in that riparian area. So in order to provide specific information for a variance request, we have to look at what's going to happen on that site specifically. So we got to get our science geek on here just a little bit. And we're going to talk about fluvial geomorphology. So fluvial being flowing, geo is earth, morph is change, ology is study. So fluvial geomorphology is the discipline of studying how flowing water changes the landscape. So if we look at these pictures and we look at the bank full width, or the width of the channel during the channel forming flow, and in relation to the watershed size, we'll go through a few examples here quickly. So this is 1/100th of a square mile watershed, probably just spring feeding this channel. It'd be a Riparian type headwater stream. You could step across that channel. Another example, 1/100th of a square mile, it's barely there. Doesn't matter if it's flowing or not, as long as it's defined channel, defined bed and bank, alluvial substrate, very small stream. Here's a 1 square mile watershed. I just love this picture. I think it's beautiful, but you can see 3 people stand up here at the top of the waterfall. A little bit wider. We'll go up to 30 square miles, wider yet, all the way up to 267 square miles. This is the Chagrin River here, quite a bit larger channel. So the larger the drainage area, the more water we have in the channel, which means there's more energy to move sediment. And that is what makes these streams look the way they do. All right, so Dave Rosgen is a pretty well-respected hydrologist, and he made this fancy saying here explaining this, but this is not happenstance. Streams don't just form and say, okay, this is just the way they're going to look. It is specifically related to physics, to the climate, and to the geology in that watershed. So if we look at this image here, you got the Mississippi River down in Louisiana. That's 3,400 feet across the channel. We look at the New Fork River in Wyoming. That's a 60-foot bank full width, and then Duck Creek, an 8-foot width. So different size streams, but what do they all share? What can we make out of this picture? They all have this sinuous pattern to their meander geometry, right? So, and we see that even in just small erosional features. This is a rill that formed on a fill for a building pad, and you can see that beautiful meander pattern, that sine wave form there. We have an idea of what these patterns are going to be, right? That's based on the bank full width of a stream channel. So we know what the wavelength and the amplitude and the radius of curvature is, roughly what it wants to be based on the width of that channel. So looking at a regional curve here, these plots, these dots are a relationship between the bank full width, which is your horizontal axis, and your drainage area on the horizontal axis. And they plot out quite nicely, not including human factors, retaining walls and culverts messing with them, but natural channels will plot out and make this nice linear trend line so we can understand what that bank full width might want to be. So the bottom one is just kind of a rehash. The bottom drawing is a rehash of that last slide. But if you look at the middle of the slide, we can see that the active floodplain might be roughly 3 times the bank full width of that channel. So you can use your local regional curves. There's a Lake Erie regional curve. Some folks have developed them for individual rivers. Or you could just start with the width of the channel and say, okay, I know roughly what that flood prone width might be. So streams will work to maintain a quasi equilibrium, given that all of these things in this lane model stay relatively even. So, but when we get these changes in a watershed, maybe we straighten the stream out, like Dave's example earlier, and we change the slope, or we're experiencing a higher recurrence interval of the channel forming flow, the Q2. We've got more flow. We don't do a good job of controlling sediment on construction sites, and we increase our sediment load, or we decrease the coarseness of our sediment size with all of the impervious surface. That channel is going to adjust. It's going to go through this deposition and erosion pattern to try and find that new happy equilibrium. So what Dave says is that we're going to see natural adjustments in sinuosity while that channel works to maintain that stable equilibrium. So a riparian setback, in my opinion, is going to allow that channel to go through that evolution process and not threaten any of our improvements or our structures that we've built in there. So putting that all together, knowing what the channel wants to do and how wide it wants to be, and I say want like it's a Disney animal, but it's the physics of it, right? And the lane model, what are we trying to head off? Deposition in culverts and having to repair infrastructure. Bank failures in side yards, and then failures of their repair for that failure. We're trying to head off endangered structures when a channel blows out its banks and starts to threaten a structure that should have been set back in that riparian setback. We're trying to head off expensive repairs. That's that same structure there. You can see the repair that they had to undertake, so that was quite costly. But now we're actually working against what the channel is trying to do to heal itself. Okay. And then obviously, we get a lot of sedimentation in streams when we get slope failures. So that's the science geek part of it. There is a basis for those widths that is related to physics and not strictly habitat related or temperature related. So understand that those riparian setback distances are tied to natural stream processes. So moving on to looking at a project specifically, we are going to break those three, flooding impacts, bank stability, and filtering, into three separate subjects. And we're going to ignore two at a time just for simplicity's sake. If this diagram here from the left side of the image to the right side of the image is our riparian setback, we need to evaluate what that variance request might look like if our shed or pool is in that lighter green area versus what it might be if it's up in that darker green area. So obviously that setback, that variance request, excuse me, should be viewed differently if we are proposing things in those two different parts of the landscape. So realize that floodplains can be a regulatory feature like a zone A or a 1% recurrence interval 100-year floodplain. But we also have floodplains that are associated with smaller flows, Q50s, Q25s, Q10s, that are typically a little bit narrower. I like using this image when I talk to folks about floodplains. This was a flooding event that occurred several years ago, maybe 13 years ago, I don't recall. Significant snow melt with a rainfall event. We had a lot of inundation that melted a lot of the snow on the landscape. So you could see where that flood stage reached, but this isn't a regulatory floodplain that it flooded. We zoom in a little bit. You can see again where that snow melted and where that water level reached during that flood stage. I'm going to throw on topos here real quick. So for discussion purposes, let's say that the riparian setback was the rear of the houses. Dave Radacci did this great setback job in the subdivision planning. The rear of the house is the setback line. We can see that the flood prone width is right there about the 614 contour. So maybe that pool at the bottom of the screen, that house at the very end of the cul-de-sac, that pool is not there. Let's say that this is a request to the local zoning. I want to put a pool in. Obviously, where that pool is constructed, that would have reduced that particular riparian setback's ability to store floodwaters because that is taking up volume in that setback. If we moved that pool from the 614 to the 616 contour, we wouldn't have impacted that stream's ability to flood up to that 614 contour, or maybe even higher. Maybe we go to the 616 to 618. So just looking specifically at the channel's ability to flood and where it might flood on a property and evaluating that specific request based on that one function of the setback. We look at a picture here. If we don't have really good GIS data, we can't make sense of where that floodplain might be based on the aerial photographs or the topos. We see a person in the background of that picture on the right side of that channel, and they are standing on a flat horizontal plane adjacent to the stream at a hydraulic break. We'd call that a floodplain. On the left side of the picture, which I believe is the right descending bank at that site, we've got much higher topography. We've got a nice steep slope. So again, just looking at flooding impacts and not talking about assimilating nutrients or pollutants or talking about bank stabilization, we had a variance request on the right side of the channel versus the left side of the channel. Those should be treated differently. Our comments to a BZA, or you're a BZA member, or perhaps a zoning inspector and you're working with your BZA, those two sides of the stream should be treated differently when we're looking at a setback's ability to reduce impacts from flooding. Second part of that purpose and intent from the first slide is assisting in stabilizing the banks. And there's two different things that I look at when I'm talking about stabilizing banks. One is vegetation, and in here we have two starkly contrasting types of vegetation. In the foreground is obviously grasses, forbs, which have very shallow roots. They may provide you some erosion control from rilling and from gully formation, but they provide zero function for shear stress and flowing water. In the background of the picture, we have woody vegetation in that riparian setback. Woody vegetation have nice deep roots, and they will provide good protection from shear stresses on those outside bends and holding those stream banks together. So now we have to make a decision if we are giving comments and we have stream bank that has grass on it. The ability of that vegetation on that stream bank to provide bank stabilization is already impaired. Are you going to base your comments then on that ability or the existing condition? We've already got an issue here, but is our setback going to lessen the channel's ability to provide that, or excuse me, is that vegetation going to lessen the ability of the stream to be blown out or increase the ability of that stream to be blown out? So neither one are right or wrong answers. They're just things that we should be considering. So, and then conversely, that obviously if we have woody vegetation, we know we're going to have good protection from shear stress. So the second is, where is that variance request in relation to meander geometry? So if we're on the outside of a meander, we should treat that differently than we would on the inside of a meander. Kind of a generalized slide here, just showing some different vegetation types. Obviously, we've got varying forms and degrees of erosion control with different vegetation types. I just kind of covered that, so I'm going to gloss over that slide. Let's say that you are providing comments to a BZA, or if you're a BZA board member, and we're looking at this deck pictured in the background here, and the variance request is to extend that deck towards the stream channel. We've got a near vertical stream bank, so very unstable. It has no roughness to it, no cobble mixed in, no boulders. It's just unconsolidated clay, so another channel that's prone to erosion. And we have basically non-existent rooting depth on that side. So extending that bank outwards, is that going to impair that channel's or impair that setback's ability to stabilize the bank? I would argue no, that it's not going to impair that ability to stabilize a bank because that bank is already unstable. Does that mean we should grant the variance? Probably not, just given the proximity and the high likelihood of bank failure here. But I just want to give you a frame of reference for how to evaluate what you see in that specific site and using that 10,000-foot view of fluvial geomorphology and knowing what that channel is going to do in providing some comments to the BZA. Moving on to position on that meander geometry, we know that on the inside of the meanders where that star is, we have low shear stress. We typically see deposition instead of erosion. On the outside of the bank where the triangle is, we have higher shear stresses. We have downstream lateral migration of a meander, and we have outward migration of a meander. So those two sites, the star and the triangle, should be viewed quite differently when evaluating whether or not we want to grant a variance request. You know, perhaps that star is a safer place if you're entertained to granting a variance than the triangle site would be, especially as we move onto the downstream inflection point as that meander pattern starts to change and go into the riffle and change in the other direction of the meander. Those are where we see the most migration in banks. So that is in the crosshairs of that stream channel's intended migration pattern. So let's move on here. Going quick, I apologize. I want to try and get us back on track as fast as we can. So the last purpose and intent function that I want to cover is reducing pollutants by filtering. And if we look at this picture, this is what I would call the gold standard. We've got a nice mature forest. We've got understory shrub vegetation. We've got nice leaf litter on the ground. So that's going to provide a lot of filtering ability. When floodwaters rise and reach that floodplain, it's going to store a lot of that floodwater in that area. It's going to assimilate some nutrients. It's going to bind some of those pollutant loads in that soil. So granting a variance in that scenario should be looked at with a lot of scrutiny. And then we add that these types of vegetation patterns also help to protect the stream bank from erosion. They're really providing two of those functions: bank stabilization and pollutants. But if we had, let me go back a slide. If we had this scenario, so let's say the variance request for this red shed at the bottom center of the channel is to move that or extend that shed 20 feet to the east, and that's within our riparian setback. How much pollutant filtering are we getting in that grassed area? What is the impact of granting that variance request to that setback's ability to reduce pollutants? And I would argue it's not much. And again, we're completely ignoring some of these others. We're just breaking this down for discussions purposes. But things to observe when you're on the site, facts to give a BZA for their consideration. Oh, and again, we've been talking about these individually, but in a real world, we don't have that luxury. We're going to have to look at how each specific variance request plays into all three of those factors and realize that each BZA person is an individual person. They're going to have their own value sets when they're looking at your recommendations or your comments, excuse me. So if we looked at this pink site, it's inside the meander, so our risk of erosion is reduced. We're in that low shear stress, but it is much closer to the stream channel than perhaps those other two sites. It's certainly within that 3 times the channel width flood prone area. We have grass on the bank, so we're probably not stabilizing the bank that much with that vegetation pattern. We're probably not reducing pollutants with a grassy lawn there. But is that a viable spot? What about the yellow spot? We are on the outside of the meander, but we're set back some distance from that pink spot. So perhaps that's a better situation. It's also on the upstream inflection point of that meander. But again, it's grass. Are we getting much floodplain pollutant filtering capacity from that site? Probably not. I'd argue you're not. You're probably on the borderline of that 3 times the flood-prone width. You're probably maybe 2. And then we look at that blue site, conversely. We're the farthest away from the stream. That's a great thing, right? Maybe that's the site we want to use. However, we are also on the outstream or outside of that meander. It's also the best vegetation patterns on that site. It's looks like native wooded vegetation. So which of these sites would be the best place for, maybe it's a shed or a fire pit or a patio or et cetera, that this person wants to build here? What do your comments look like to a BZA? And are you making recommendations to the BZA? Hey, I think we should move this person's request over here. Or are you just strictly giving them the information? Hey, this site is on the outside of a meander. It's prone to erosion. It's up on a high on the landscape, so it probably isn't getting flooded. And it's got native vegetation, so it's holding the stream bank together. Or are you going to go to the extent and say, this is a bad idea? Or if we're going to grant that, what remedial actions might we want? Let's say the blue is where they want to do that. And you say, hey, you know what? We're going to give up some native vegetation there. That it is a nice far distance from the stream. So maybe that pink spot, we're going to replant that. But then who polices that? Who's going to be the responsible party for watching that if it's not written into your code that there's going to be a deed restriction on there? So I know I went through that very quickly. Feel free to reach out to me afterwards if you've got questions. I see a few down in the chat. So I'm going to give back the remote control to Kim and entertain some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Chad. We will go ahead and answer any questions related to your presentation, but also open it up to our general Q&A. We had 10 minutes set aside for this, so please feel free to enter your questions into the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, we can call on you that way as well. So I am backing up in the chat here. Just bear with me for a moment. We had a question here from Tracy. Who is responsible for maintaining the stream? Maybe we'll just take that one question first. Who is responsible for maintaining the stream?
So I'll start with that one. Largely, no one. No one is responsible. The only exception from a legal standpoint are the petition ditches, and we'll put ditches in air quotes there. That's a practice that we see a lot in our more rural communities with large agricultural practices where they're paying a fee for the soil and water district to go in and do some channel shaping and clean out, right, log jams, et cetera. And that's largely based on some drainage issues that some of these farming communities were seeing. But nobody is responsible for maintaining a stream. Nobody is responsible for maintaining a stream bank. Nobody is responsible for pulling log jams out, at least in the county that I work in and the county that I live in and my experiences. So if there's others on here, I see some cameras popping on that want to share their experiences, I'll shut up now.
Chad, I would just add to that. So in our service area, we are a stormwater utility. So we are collecting fees from residents to maintain that regional stormwater system. So under that program, we do have a inspection and maintenance group. The role of the maintenance group is to, similar to the petition ditches, make sure that culvert inlets, outlets are clear of debris, remove sediment, those sorts of things. So maintaining conveyance within that system is the type of maintenance that's performed. Then on the construction side, we do have projects along that regional stormwater system in areas where we're trying to minimize the impacts of flooding and or reduce the effects of erosion or improve water quality. So, but again, that's within the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District because we are a stormwater utility.
Great. Thank you, David. We have another question here. And do ponds also have riparian setbacks? I'm glad to let someone take a stab at that. If not, I can jump in. But would anyone like to take a stab at answering that one?
I guess it all depends on if your riparian setback covers ponds and if it's attached to a stream or not. If it's just a standalone pond and if you have a pond setback, then that's a separate issue altogether.
Tracy, are you
But
asking if it's an online pond where the stream flows into the pond and then outflows, or is this just something adjacent to the channel?
They don't say, so maybe we could answer first about inline ponds and then maybe secondarily address offline ponds.
I would argue they would then. That pond would be part of the stream channel. And looking at the functions, those three functions that I was speaking about, you would want that setback on there.
Yeah, and I could just add to that, as for CRWP's model riparian setback code, yeah, inline ponds would have a setback that would apply to them. Our setback would extend from the stream center line as it crosses through that inline pond. So that's just how our model code works. Every community may vary in how they handle inline ponds and setbacks. If you do have an offline pond, you may want to consider any sort of wetland impacts, and if a community has a wetland setback, if there's any wetland fringe around that pond, that may be something to consider as well. If your community has wetland setbacks, that might flag that for review. Great. We had a question earlier about, sorry, I'm scrolling up, from Patrick. How do you deal with individual homeowners that lack the resources for performing the required evaluations for riparian determination and possible mitigation plans? I wondered if anyone might be willing to jump in who may have experienced something like this in your community. Do you have any feedback on this question? Yeah, that's a tricky one. I'm not aware of, I haven't experienced communities that provide any sort of assistance or funding for that kind of thing. It is the responsibility of the applicant to do those sorts of evaluations, but that's just been my experience. I'm not sure if other speakers or other communities we have here in the audience can speak to that more than I can.
So none of the communities that I'm aware of in Lake County have required mitigation in their setbacks, but we do help landowners, mostly at the request of the local zoning. We'll come out and we'll flag the ordinary high water mark, and we'll pull a tape measure out and set that riparian setback distance on their property for them, so they can evaluate what kind of impact they might have in their application.
Thank you, Chad. Great. Thank you for the comment in the chat there about the Ohio Revised Code does provide some responsibility for maintaining a water course when there's an obstruction exists. I believe particularly if there are impacts to adjacent properties and that sort of thing. So please note that code regarding responsibilities to remove obstructions if it's causing flooding or erosion issues to adjacent properties. Great. Well, any other questions, please add them to the chat or raise your hand and we will call on you to speak.
Hey, Kim, you brought up before non-conforming uses, and I thought somebody would cover this. Non-conforming use is aka grandfathering, is a use of a building that were legal, or a use of a building that were legal when they were established, but when the riparian setback came in, they're no longer conforming. They can continue on as forever, so long as that they continue the use or continue that building. But if they stop it for a certain period of time or remove it for a certain period of time, they're no longer allowed. And so a lot of communities will have non-conforming rules in their zoning regs, and each community should probably take a look at their non-conforming rules to make sure that they're compliant to their goals of a riparian setback. There's a lot of times that will allow like 10%, a 10% increase of a use or 10% increase of a building if it's non-conforming, and then you have to go through a zoning variance procedure. You can eliminate that. I think you might be able to eliminate that expansion of a building inside a riparian setback, because it's going to be detrimental to the stream if you expand that setback. So they should probably consult with their legal counsels or look to see if they can eliminate increasing of the use in a non-conforming use inside a riparian setback. So also,
Right.
if a building's half in a setback and half out of a setback, if they want to put an addition on, they should push the addition to outside the setback. And then non-conforming vacant lots are lots that were created, and they're usually non-conforming for lot sizes or for widths. And so if you have a quarter acre lot and the community is now half acre, those lots are still legal to build on if they meet all the setbacks. It's not a blank check for all the setbacks to be eliminated. So if it's a riparian setback is on there, they still need to adhere to that riparian setback in a non-conforming lot.
Great. Thank you for that added detail about non-conforming uses, David. Wonderful. Well, please feel free to add more questions in the chat as we go. We did have a 5-minute break built in here, but I think we're going to skip that in the interest of time. If you need a break, please step away and take one. With that, I'm going to move on. Part of this workshop is to allow communities that do have setbacks, riparian and wetland setbacks on the books, to learn from each other. So we do have a highlight from Heather Freeman with Concord Township in Lake County. And there's going to share a bit about their experience with riparian setbacks, lessons learned, challenges, and so forth. And so with that, I am going to hand it to you, Heather.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Heather Freeman. I'm the Planning and Zoning Director for Concord Township, which is in Lake County. Today, I'm going to speak briefly about Concord's experience with riparian setbacks. I'm going to start with some brief background information about Concord and then talk about some challenges, benefits, and lessons learned with implementing riparian setbacks as a zoning tool. Okay. So Concord Township is approximately 23.1 square miles in area and is located in Lake County, just south of Painesville City, the county seat. The 2020 census reported a population of 19,560 people. The township is developed with many residential subdivisions with lots ranging from minimum lot sizes of 0.25 acres up to 2 acres. Outside of the subdivisions, there are many properties fronting on state and county roadways, which tend to be on larger tracts of land and more semi-rural in nature. Commercial corridors are concentrated near the State Route 44 and I-90 interchange. Concord's 2004 Comprehensive Land Use Plan recommended the adoption of riparian and wetland setbacks as a zoning tool. However, the township never seriously considered them until after another plan update in 2015. After working closely with the Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District and the Chagrin River Watershed partners, the township adopted riparian and wetland setback regulations that became effective July of 2016. Additionally, conservation zoning is another zoning tool that we've had in place in our zoning resolutions since 2004, but despite requiring open spaces for protection of streams and wetlands and forested areas, the riparian corridors still had potential negative impacts from construction and development. However, now with both tools, the township has been able to encourage these riparian areas to be placed in open space, knowing that their corridors will be protected from development in the future. Next slide. Here's an image of the riparian setback guide map that we have available as part of our zoning resolution, and it is on our township website. As far as what the setbacks are that we adopted, they range from a maximum of 120 feet down to 25 feet, depending on the drainage area. We did follow the Chagrin River Watershed Partners model pretty closely. The setback is also extended to the boundary of the 100-year FEMA floodplain. And additionally, if a wetland falls within the riparian setback, the setback is extended to the boundary of the wetland. Depending on the category of the wetland, there could be an additional setback from that wetland as well. As you can see, this map also shows our parcel layer. You can see there's many developments throughout the township, especially on the west side, while the larger tracts of land are generally in the eastern portion of the township. Most of our setbacks are smaller 25-foot setbacks. It's the lighter yellow orange that you can see on the map. Initially, the township did receive some pushback from developers about the new riparian setback regulations. There were several existing lots and subdivisions that were created prior to the enactment of the riparian setbacks that were vacant and that now became difficult to find a location to construct a home because there was a designated water course on the parcel. These lots tended to be more challenging to build on anyways, even without the riparian setback to consider. However, as discussed earlier in this workshop, variances are a possibility. There were about a half a dozen sublots that did get variances approved to grade and disturb land within the riparian area in order to accommodate a new dwelling. Most were able to keep the dwelling itself out of the setback. I did look at some data regarding variances in Concord and found out that over the last 8 years, there were 27 variances to the riparian setback regulations, which made up about 15% of all variance applications. To help put that in perspective, the township averages 375 zoning permits annually. So I feel like this is just a small percent. The majority of the variances that were approved to the riparian setback were for accessory uses in residential districts on lots that were platted prior to the riparian setbacks being adopted. One of the challenges that I see with the regulations is that the setbacks are only applicable when a zoning permit is required. Therefore, this still allows for some removal of vegetation and creation of lawn areas within riparian areas and also other structures that may not be regulated by our zoning book. Additionally, during subdivision development, it's difficult to ensure that the riparian areas are being protected while the infrastructure is being built. However, working with the Lake County Planning Commission and the Soil and Water Conservation District, the township does have the ability to voice their concerns during plan review process to ensure that protection fencing is installed along riparian areas before the trees are taken down. However, the follow-up and inspection is really outside of the township's purview as we don't control the subdivision review process. So now the rules have really been in place for over 8 years, and I feel like the land developers and builders are less resistant to complying with the riparian setbacks, and they're typically able to plan and design their new projects with the setbacks in mind. All future subdivisions and lots will be designed with the riparian setbacks in mind, which will help limit encroachments. Concord Township does institute a site plan review process as well for all new commercial and multifamily projects. As part of this review process, designated water courses and wetlands need to be identified in the site plan to ensure compliance with the riparian setbacks. This process allows the staff and the zoning boards to provide feedback regarding the design to ensure that those areas are being protected. While working with the residents on a daily basis to review zoning permits, it does take some extra time to make sure that if there is a riparian setback on their property, that the impacts that may impact where a landowner may want to construct a new, that impacts where a landowner may want may be able to construct a new accessory building. It just takes a little bit more time to work through that process. Pre-inspection may be necessary to help identify the precise location of the riparian setback if it's too close, according to our guide map. So initially, we'll look at the guide map. We'll use our Lake County GIS tools that we have available to us. If the project seems to be very close to that setback, I will coordinate a site visit with the landowner, Chad, typically from Lake Soil and Water, and the resident to meet at the property. The site visit is a great opportunity to explain the reasons why the township has adopted the regulations and the importance of the riparian area. And if there's no other locations suitable on the property for the shed or the pool or whatever the structure is that the property owner wants to do, it does provide us an opportunity to inform them about the variance process and what the board may be considering while making their decision. This is also when Chad with Soil and Water would discuss some of the factors that he would be looking at as well that he mentioned previously in this workshop. I believe overall the residents and our elected officials see the value of the riparian setback, and I believe that the true benefits of the setback will be realized in the years to come. Finally, I just want to mention a few lessons learned and closing thoughts. For the people in the zoning office or the local township that might not have the expertise in natural resource protection, which I don't, work on building that relationship with your soil and water. They can assist you with some of the technical aspects. As mentioned previously, I will ask Chad to come out with me and help identify that ordinary high water mark and set flags to where the riparian setback boundary is, and helps with the explanation to the homeowner as to the why. Another tool I use during the permit review process is our Lake County GIS online mapping tool. Here we can view an aerial image of the property with streams, overlaying topo, the riparian setback layer, in order to see if there may be a riparian setback on that property. So working through the permit process, if I see that there is potential of a riparian setback, I do try to talk to the landowner about other locations on the property that might work, trying to steer them out of the riparian setback. If not, it is possible to request a different setback variance in order to uphold the riparian setback. So maybe keeping the 25-foot setback, but asking for a reduction on a side yard. Maybe that's the route to go. I do find that being consistent with enforcement is key to keeping, or it's really key in this process. The developers and landowners need to know what the expectations from the community are going to be. Making sure that they understand that protection fencing needs to be installed prior to any kind of earthwork happening. Our resolution requires them to contact us a few days prior to any work so we can come out and make sure that the protection fencing is in place. I think we're going to have to work on that follow-up a little bit more. I thought that was good. The point that Brent brought up earlier, follow up, making sure that they're still complying. And then finally, I think it's probably about time that we need to start looking at some possible updates to our riparian setback regulations. As mentioned previously, they're only applicable when a zoning permit is necessary in Concord. There are many uses that don't require a zoning permit. For example, a patio would be allowed potentially to encroach that riparian area, since our zoning resolution does not require a zoning permit for a patio. Additionally, we don't have any provisions about restoration or mitigation if riparian areas are impacted. So that may be something we want to look at, and possibly adding some requirements for signage so landowners understand that there are protected areas on their properties. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing Concord Township's experience with riparian setbacks. Appreciate it. If anyone has questions for Heather, please pop them in the chat for her. We are going to be ending at 4 o'clock today, so we're going to kind of breeze through what we have left on the agenda. We're not going to have 15 minutes for this, but we will have maybe about 5 to 8 minutes for community breakout discussions. We will break you into some groups, and we encourage you to just share your experience with riparian setbacks. Have you seen a value of having setbacks in your community? Are there specific examples of how you've seen setbacks demonstrate their value? What kind of challenges do you encounter when you're implementing those setback codes? Do you think more education is required in the community about setbacks? What kind of advice or more information would you like to learn from other communities? And do you have lessons learned that you can share with other communities? So this will be very brief, but if you're willing to stick around for about 8 more minutes here, we'll split you up into groups for 5 to 8 minutes, and then we'll reconvene for just a minute to wrap up by 4 o'clock. So with that, Kevin on our team is going to divide you into groups right now. Okay. Everybody is hopping back into our main room here. Sorry that was so brief, but we had such good discussion today that we were a little pinched for time at the end. I just wanted to wrap up today by sharing that your community has many different outlets for support on this topic. Everybody lives in a county in Ohio, so you have a county soil and water conservation district. They're there to help you with natural resources management. Also, county planning agencies, regional planning agencies, stormwater utilities, if that's relevant to your area, local watershed organizations, American Planning Association of Ohio and local chapters has great resources for you, and the Ohio Township Association, just to name a few resources for everybody that's out there to help you as you implement your codes. And also wanted to share the contact information for the speakers that we had today. If you have follow-up questions, please reach out to any of us with your questions. And as I mentioned before, we did record today's training. We'll send that to everybody that was registered. So with that, I think we're at 4 o'clock. So thank you for your time today. Hope you enjoyed the workshop, and hope you all have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you.